You have exactly one curtsy to prove you know your place, healer. The voice belonged to a woman Nessa Blackwood had never met but recognized instantly. The kind of voice that had practiced authority the way some women practice piano scales, daily for years with diminishing returns. Nessa's fingers were still dusty with dried comfrey, her knees aching from the long walk across the estate grounds to Ravensmere Hall. The assembled guests in the great parlor were watching her the way cats watch a beetle on flagstone. I was invited, Nessa said. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and met the woman's gaze without blinking. By Mr. Hale himself, to treat his housekeeper's breathing trouble. If the welcome has changed since luncheon, someone might have sent a note. The woman, tall, immaculate, her dark hair pinned with pearl combs worth more than Nessa's entire cottage, took a single step forward. Mr. Hale's household affairs are now managed by me. I am Beatrice Ashford. The housekeeper's breathing trouble has been seen to by a physician from Bath. Your services are not required. The room smelled of beeswax candles and hothouse lilies, and the particular sharp tang of social cruelty dressed as hospitality. Behind Beatrice Ashford, 24 guests held teacups like shields. Nessa counted the faces that looked away. 14. She noted the number the way she noted the stages of a tincture. Observation first, reaction later. Mrs. Ashford, Nessa said, keeping her voice as even as a measured spoonful. A physician from Bath is a fine thing for a cough. But Mrs. Garner's trouble is not a cough. It sits lower, in the base of the lungs, and it worsens when the air is damp. I have been treating her for 3 years. I imagine the physician told you the same and charged you 4 shillings for the privilege. A ripple of something passed through the nearest guests, not quite laughter, quickly suppressed. Beatrice Ashford's smile thinned to something blade-like. You are dismissed. If you have difficulty understanding that word, I can have a footman explain it at the door. Nessa's fingernails bit into her satchel strap. She had walked 4 miles in shoes that had been resoled twice. She had mixed Mrs. Garner's tonic at dawn, the smell of horehound and thyme still clinging to her wrists. She was 41 years old, and she was tired of rooms that wanted her gone. She straightened her posture the way she adjusted the flame beneath a kettle, small, deliberate, precise. I will leave when Mrs. Garner tells me she no longer needs me, she said. Not before. That was when she saw him. He stood at the far end of the parlor near the garden doors, half turned, as if he had been about to leave, and then stopped. He was tall, angular, dressed in a dark coat that sat on his shoulders as though it had been made for someone who moved less carefully. His face was all planes and sharp lines, and his skin carried a pallor that did not belong to someone who lived in the English countryside. His chest did not move. Nessa noticed this, the way she noticed all symptoms, automatically, cataloging without yet diagnosing. She filed it between the coldness of his expression and the way the candlelight near him burned steadier than it should. She knew him. Not his name, she had never learned it. But she knew the shape of him, the particular stillness, the way his gray eyes moved slowly as if time cost him nothing. 7 years ago, on a frozen night in a shepherd's hut on the edge of Dartmoor, she had set a dislocated shoulder for a stranger who would not explain why he was bleeding and whose skin had been cold as river stone even beside the fire. He had thanked her with a voice that sounded like it had not been used in weeks. He had left before morning. She had found a gold sovereign on the table where her candle had been. He was looking at her now with an expression she could not read. Behind him, half hidden by his shadow, stood a young woman in a maid's uniform. The left side of her face carried a constellation of old scars, pale, ridged, the kind that came from scalding water or kitchen accidents endured without proper treatment. She was gripping a tray of empty teacups and her eyes were fixed on the floor. Beatrice Ashford's voice cut through again, louder now, performing for the room. I said you are dismissed, or do village healers not understand English when it is spoken by their betters? Nessa looked at the scarred maid. She looked at the woman's hands, steady on the tray despite the tremor in her jaw. She looked at the gold ring on Beatrice Ashford's hand, the proprietary way Ashford had positioned herself between the stranger and the rest of the room. the arrangement of power in the parlor like herbs sorted into jars. Everything labeled, everything in its proper place. Nessa turned to face the room fully. She did not curtsy to the tall stranger. She did not curtsy to Beatrice Ashford. Instead, she walked 3 steps to her left, stopped in front of the scarred maid, and dipped into a curtsy so low her knee nearly touched the floor. "Good afternoon," Nessa said to the maid. "I'm Nessa Blackwood. I'm the healer, and those scars on your hand have not been dressed in at least a fortnight. May I see?" The silence in the parlor was the kind that has weight. Someone set down a teacup with a sound like a small bone breaking. Beatrice Ashford's face went the color of unset tallow. "How dare you? In this house, to a servant." "I curtsy to the people who need me," Nessa said, still looking at the maid. "It saves a great deal of time." The maid, whose name, Nessa would later learn, was Ruth, looked up. Her eyes were wide and wet and utterly startled, as if she had forgotten that anyone in a room like this could see her at all. She gave the smallest nod. And behind Ruth, the tall stranger with the still chest and the gray eyes took 1 step forward, then another. The guest nearest to him shifted aside without seeming to decide to, the way water parts for the prow of a boat. He crossed the parlor with the unhurried precision of someone who had never needed to rush for anything in a very long life, and he stopped beside Nessa. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and his voice was exactly as Nessa remembered, low, careful, carrying the faint grain of disuse. "I believe you told these guests that you manage my household." He paused. The candlelight did not flicker. "You do not. You are a guest. Miss Blackwood is here at my invitation. If she wishes to treat every servant in this house, she has my full support." His gaze moved to Nessa. Something shifted in it, recognition, then something quieter, more private, quickly shuddered. "You set my shoulder once," he said, "on Dartmoor." "You left without letting me check if it healed properly," Nessa said. "That was 7 years ago. I've been annoyed about it ever since." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of one, as if smiling were a language he had spoken once and nearly forgotten. "It healed," he said. "Good," Nessa said. "Then you owe me for the visit and the 7 years of wondering." A voice came from the doorway behind them. Brisk, warm, faintly exasperated, belonging to a woman in a green traveling dress who was pulling off her gloves with the air of someone who had arrived exactly when she meant to. "Nessa Blackwood, you absolute terror. I leave Somerset for 3 months, and you're starting wars in parlors." Nessa turned. Margaret Thorne, who had been Margaret Pine when they were young, before she married well and kept her opinions, strode into the room with the confidence of a woman who had been invited to everything since she was 20 and had attended only the events worth her time. She looked at Beatrice Ashford. She looked at Nessa. She looked at the tall stranger. She looked at Ruth's scarred hands. "Right," Margaret said. "I can see I've missed something appalling. Someone get me tea and tell me who to be furious with." Nessa felt the first loosening in her chest since she had walked through the door. Margaret had always been the person who said the thing everyone was thinking, loudly, in well-bred tones that made it impossible to object. The stranger, Mr. Hale, they called him, though Nessa had learned on Dartmoor that names meant little to men who carried that particular kind of silence, offered Nessa the use of the kitchen to treat Ruth's hands. Beatrice Ashford watched them go with an expression like vinegar poured on something sweet. In the kitchen, Nessa unwound the bandage from Ruth's left hand and found what she expected, an old scald, poorly treated, now cracked and weeping at the edges. She cleaned it with chamomile water and applied a salve of calendula and honey, her hands moving in the steady rhythm that was her version of prayer. Ruth said nothing for a long time. "She burned you," Nessa said. Not a question. Ruth's silence was its own answer. "The water was meant for linens," Ruth said finally. "She said I was too slow." Nessa wrapped the new bandage with careful pressure, her jaw tight. "You work for Mr. Hale. He doesn't know. Mrs. Ashford manages the household when he's away. He's away a great deal. Ruth hesitated. He's kind when he's here, but he doesn't see. Nessa thought about a man whose chest did not rise and whose skin was cold as river stone. She thought about what it meant to be away a great deal. She tucked the end of the bandage neatly and said, "Then someone will have to show him." That evening, Mr. Hale, his given name, she learned from Margaret, was Elias, found her in the herb garden behind the kitchen. The lavender was past its prime, the sage overgrown, the rosemary reaching woody and forgotten toward a wall that had not been tended in years. Nessa was cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, by what could still be saved. "You remember me," he said from behind her, and the fact that she had not heard him approach told her something she was not ready to name. "I remember everyone I've treated," she said, pressing her thumb against a rosemary stalk. The sharp green scent rose between them. "You had a dislocated shoulder and a laceration along the ribs. You wouldn't tell me how you got either one. Your skin was cold and your pulse was unusual. You counted my pulse." He said it as though this surprised him more than anything else. "I'm a healer. I count everything. Breaths per minute, heartbeats, the number of people in a room who are looking at me versus the number pretending they aren't." She glanced at him. "Yours was 11 beats per minute. I assumed the cold had slowed it. And now? Now I assume something else." She turned the rosemary stalk between her fingers. "But you're not here to discuss your circulation, Mr. Hale." He was quiet for a moment. The evening air carried the smell of damp earth and the last heat of the day rising from the stone wall. "Mrs. Ashford has been telling the staff she will be mistress of this house by autumn," he said. "She has been telling the village the same. I did not know until today." "And you want me to tell you what else she's been doing that you haven't noticed?" His gray eyes found hers. In the fading light, they were the color of winter mornings. "I want you to stay," he said, "to treat Ruth and anyone else who needs you. There is a cottage on the grounds that has been empty for years. It was once a still room." Nessa's lungs seized mid-draw, not at the offer, but at the specificity of it. A still room, as if he had known exactly what she would need before she knew she needed it. "Why?" she asked. "Because 7 years ago you were the only person who touched me without flinching," he said. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, and Nessa stood in the dying garden with her hands full of rosemary and her heart doing something complicated and inconvenient. Margaret appeared at her elbow like a weather front. "So you're staying, obviously." "I haven't decided." "Nessa, the man gave you a cottage with a still room. That's not an offer, that's a proposal. You're staying." Nessa moved into the still room cottage 2 days later. She brought her satchel, her dried herbs, her copper distillation apparatus, and the conviction that she was here to help Ruth and the household staff and nothing more. She told herself this 3 times while unpacking, which was exactly twice more than a woman who believed it would need. Beatrice Ashford's first retaliation came within the week. Nessa arrived at the village market to find that the apothecary had stopped carrying her tinctures. "Mrs. Ashford spoke with the owner," Margaret reported, settling into the stillroom's only good chair with the air of someone who planned to stay. "Told him you were unlicensed and your remedies were dangerous. He's afraid of losing his custom." "I have been selling tinctures through that shop for 6 years, Nessa said, measuring dried elderflower with a precision that steadied her hands. "She's been in Somerset for 3 months. "She's efficient," Margaret said. "I'll give her that. She's also told Lady Pemberton that you were dismissed from a household in Devon for improper conduct, which is fascinating given that you've never been to Devon." Nessa set down the measuring spoon. "What does she want? Him, the house, the position. You're in her way because he looks at you the way bread looks at butter. Like the entire purpose of his existence suddenly makes sense." Margaret picked up a bundle of dried thyme and sniffed it. "You could fight her. You have something she doesn't." "What?" "People trust you. Every kitchen in every great house within 20 miles has someone you've treated. They talk to you. They tell you things while you're dressing their wounds and mixing their tonics. That's power, Nessa. The the quiet kind. But Nessa was not here for power. She was here because Beatrice Ashford had burned a maid's hands, and no one had noticed. Because a man with gray eyes and no visible heartbeat had remembered her across 7 years of what she was beginning to understand had been an extraordinarily lonely existence. The intimacy grew in the way of two people who had both learned to be careful with themselves. Elias came to the still room in the evenings. He sat in the corner while she worked, asking questions about her preparations, not to fill silence, but because he was genuinely interested. She learned that he knew the Latin names of plants she knew only by their common ones, that he could identify the age of a dried herb by scent alone. She learned that his hands were always cold, and that when he stood too close, the candle flames burned steadier. "You have not eaten today," she said one evening, not looking up from her mortar and pestle. He did not deny it. "I manage." Managing is not eating. She ground the dried valerian root with 3 firm rotations and then set the pestle down. "Whatever it is you require, and I am beginning to understand it is not bread and soup, you should not pretend it doesn't exist. Pretending is what makes people ill." Something shifted in his expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or the particular relief of a man who has been seen and not screamed at. "You are very direct," he said. "I'm a healer. If I can't say this will hurt, I can't say this will help either." The honesty goes both directions. He reached across the workbench and his cold fingers brushed hers. Neither of them moved away. Margaret, arriving the next morning with a basket of eggs, took one look at Nessa's face and said, "You touched hands, didn't you? I can always tell. You look like someone who's just discovered that the recipe she's been following for years has an ingredient she missed." "Please stop talking," Nessa said, but she was almost smiling. The second blow from Beatrice Ashford came at the Michaelmas dinner hosted at Ravensmere. Nessa had not been invited. Ashford had arranged that, but Margaret had credentials enough to bring her as a companion. They arrived to find the great dining hall full of the county's notable families. Beatrice Ashford seated at the head of the table as if she already owned the house. Midway through the soup course, Ashford rose. "I feel I must share something that troubles me," she said, in the carrying voice of someone who has rehearsed their concern. Miss Blackwood, who has been residing in a cottage on this estate, was dismissed from her previous situation under circumstances that I have verified through correspondence. She produced a letter. "Dr. Merton of Taunton has confirmed that her methods are unsanctioned and potentially harmful. I have forwarded this information to the local magistrate." The room went still. Nessa felt every eye land on her like the weight of wet wool. The soup smelled of parsnip and betrayal. "Dr. Merton," Nessa said, standing, her voice as level as a tincture measured to the drop, "retired from practice 4 years ago. He now sells patent remedies by post. I would be fascinated to read his expert opinion, given that the last time I saw him, he asked me what I used for his wife's joint pain because his own prescriptions weren't working." A murmur moved through the guests. Ashford's composure held, but her knuckles whitened on the letter. "Regardless, the magistrate will make his own determination." Elias spoke from the far end of the table. "Mrs. Ashford, you have produced a letter from a retired physician to discredit someone who has treated every household in this room. Would you like to ask the room who they trust?" No one spoke, but Nessa saw the faces that turned toward her. The cook from Briarfield, whose son she had treated for lung weakness, the gardener from Whitmore whose hands she had wrapped through 2 winters, the housekeeper from Pendleton Hall whose sleeping draughts Nessa still mixed every month. These were the people who talked freely around the woman who fed them and healed them. These were her witnesses. The dinner ended early. Nessa returned to the still room and sat in the dark for a long time. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, but she was the kind who understood when a situation had escalated beyond tinctures and good intentions. This was the night she was honest with herself about why she had truly come. She had come because Margaret had written to her 3 months ago with a specific request: find out what Elias Hale was. Margaret's late husband had owned the mortgage on Ravensmere. Beatrice Ashford, who was the solicitor's sister, wanted the estate and believed that if Hale could be proven to be operating under a false identity, if he was not who his deeds claimed, the property could be challenged. Margaret had asked Nessa to get close to him, to observe, to report. Nessa had agreed because she needed the money. Her cottage lease was expiring. Her income from tincture sales had been dwindling. Margaret's offer had been generous, and the memory of the man on Dartmoor had made it easy to justify. She was simply checking on an old patient. But the checking had become something else entirely. She had reported to Margaret twice. The first time, his skin is unnaturally cold, his pulse is nearly absent. The second time, I believe he is not human, but I cannot name what he is, and he has been nothing but gentle. She had not sent a third report. She had stopped being Margaret's spy the night Elias's fingers touched hers over the valerian root, and she had not told either of them. The truth sat in her chest like an unground stone. 3 days later, Elias found it. He had gone to the still room while Nessa was in the village. He had been looking for a book she had mentioned, Culpepper's Herbal, and instead he found Margaret's letters tucked inside the cover. The first letter, with its instructions. The second, requesting a progress report. And Nessa's draft replies, in her careful hand, describing his symptoms like a case study. When Nessa returned, he was standing in the center of the still room holding the letters. His face had the terrifying blankness of something old and vast that has decided to be very still. Pulse nearly absent, he read aloud. Skin temperature consistent with a body several hours dead. Subject does not appear to breathe while at rest. He looked at her. Subject. Elias, you came here to investigate me, for Margaret Thorne, who owns the mortgage on my home. His voice did not rise, it dropped. The candle flame beside him went out. You came into my house, you treated my people, you sat with me in this room and spoke about honesty going both directions, and the entire time, I stopped, Nessa said. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her apron, feeling the rough linen, the familiar texture of something that could be controlled. I stopped sending reports weeks ago. What I told you about honesty, I meant it. You meant it while sitting on a lie. He set the letters on the workbench with a precision that frightened her more than shouting would have. Leave. The cottage. The grounds. By morning. He left without looking back. The door did not slam. He closed it with the care of a man who did not trust himself to be careless. Nessa sat on the still room floor among her herbs and her instruments and her meticulous labels, and she breathed. In, 4 counts. Out, 6. A ratio she had taught to patients with panic in their lungs. She had never needed it for herself until now. She packed by lamplight. She walked to the village inn with her satchel on her back and her copper apparatus in a crate, and she paid for a room with the last of Margaret's money. Tasted like ash in her mouth. Margaret came the next morning. Nessa opened the door and said, You used me. You used my connection to him to try to take his home. Margaret had the grace to look uncomfortable. I asked you to observe. The property claim is legitimate. His deed of ownership predates any living solicitor's records. Beatrice and I simply want to know how that is possible. Beatrice. The name landed like a dropped pan. You and Beatrice Ashford are working together. She approached me. The mortgage gives me standing. Her brother is the solicitor who could challenge the deed. It's business, Nessa. It's cruelty dressed as business. That woman burned a maid's hands. She has spent months destroying my livelihood, and you put me in her path like a tool and called it friendship. Margaret flinched. To her credit, she did not argue. I didn't know about Ruth, or the tincture shop. I didn't know she was... You didn't ask. Nessa closed the door. Alone, she made a tincture of chamomile for her own nerves, measuring each step with exaggerated care because the alternative was falling apart. She was 41. She had no home, no shop, no cottage. The only man who had ever looked at her as if she were remarkable had just discovered she had been studying him like a specimen. She deserved every bit of this. That was the worst part. Elias, in the empty still room, held the Culpepper's herbal that still smelled of her, comfrey and rosemary and the particular warmth of a living woman, and felt something he had not felt in a century. Not anger, grief. The specific grief of someone who had allowed himself to be known and then discovered that the knowing had been purchased. The rooms were colder without her. Ruth noticed. The kitchen staff noticed. The lavender she had been coaxing back in the garden began to wilt within days, though that may have been the weather. A week passed. Then Beatrice Ashford made her final move. She filed a formal challenge to Elias Hale's ownership of Ravensmere, using Margaret's mortgage as leverage and her brother as solicitor. The claim alleged that no person named Elias Hale appeared in any parish record, tax roll, or census within 50 years. The implication was fraud, that the man living at Ravensmere was an impostor who had forged his deeds. This was, Nessa realized when Margaret brought her the news looking gray-faced and shaken, technically true. Elias Hale had lived at Ravensmere for far longer than 50 years. His deeds were genuine. But he was not the same Elias Hale who had originally signed them, because no human man could be. Beatrice Ashford's challenge would force a public inquiry. An inquiry would require Elias to appear before witnesses. Witnesses who might notice what Nessa had noticed: the stillness, the cold, the impossible pause between breaths. "She'll expose him," Nessa said, "not as a fraud, as something worse." Margaret stood in the doorway of the inn-room, looking like a woman who had just understood the consequences of what she had set in motion. "What do we do?" "We? There is no we, Margaret. You did this." "I know, and I am here, asking you what to do, because you are the only person in this county who understands what he is and what he is not." "He is not dangerous. I know that now. Help me fix this." Nessa looked at her oldest friend. She thought about honesty going both directions. She thought about the sovereign on the table 7 years ago, left by a man who did not know how to say thank you, because he had forgotten that anyone would help him without wanting something in return. She thought about the scars on Ruth's hands. "I will fix this," Nessa said, "but not for you, and not the way you'd choose." She went to Ravensmere. She stood at the front door and knocked. When a footman opened it, she said, "Tell Mr. Hale that Miss Blackwood is here without deception, without letters, and without anyone's instructions. Tell him I have information about Beatrice Ashford's legal challenge, and I would like 5 minutes of his time. He can count them himself." Elias appeared in the doorway. He looked at her the way winter looks at the first crocus, wanting to believe in it, not yet willing. "5 minutes," he said. "Ashford has filed a challenge to your deed. She is using Margaret's mortgage and her brother's position as solicitor. The hearing will be public. She intends to prove you don't exist in any record." Nessa kept her voice measured, clinical, a healer delivering a diagnosis. "You and I both know why those records don't match. I will not explain what you are to the room, but I need to explain what I can do. Which is, I have spent 20 years treating the people of this county. Every great house, every kitchen, every back room where servants eat and talk. I know who Beatrice Ashford truly is. I know that she dismissed a cook at Briarfield for refusing to falsify the household accounts. I know she arranged for a maid at Whitmore to be let go without reference when the maid refused her attentions toward the master. I know she forged a letter of recommendation to secure her current position at Ravensmere. I know these things because the people she hurt came to me for tonics and tea and told me their stories while I dressed their wounds." Elias was very still. "You want to present this at the hearing. I want to show the room who she is before she can show them who you are. But I need your permission. And I need you to know that I am doing this because I was wrong, and because your home should not be the price of my mistake." The silence stretched. Then, "You said the trust goes both directions." "I did. And I broke it. I'm not asking you to trust me again. I'm asking you to let me earn the chance to." He held the door open wider. "Your 5 minutes are up," he said. "You had better come in and take longer." The hearing was held at the village assembly rooms on a Tuesday that smelled of rain and furniture polish. Half the county attended. Beatrice Ashford sat at the front with her brother, the solicitor, and a stack of documents proving the absence of Elias Hale from every public record. Margaret sat 3 rows back, rigid with guilt. Nessa waited until the solicitor had finished his presentation. Then she stood. "I am Nessa Blackwood. I am a healer. I have no legal standing, no title, and no property. But I have been in the kitchens and sick rooms of every house in this county for 20 years. I have something the records do not: the testimony of the people Mrs. Ashford has harmed." She called them by name: Mrs. Linden, the cook from Briarfield; Sarah Pierce, the maid from Whitmore; Thomas Gray, the gardener who had witnessed the forged letter. One by one they stood from different parts of the room. Ordinary people, servants and tradespeople, who had come because Nessa had asked, and because they trusted the woman who had treated their hands and their lungs and their sleepless nights. Each one spoke briefly. Each one named what Beatrice Ashford had done to them. Ashford rose. "This is slander. This is a village healer's gossip presented as evidence." "It is not gossip," Nessa said. "Gossip is what you told Lady Pemberton about me. What these people are doing is testifying. There is a difference. One requires courage." The room shifted. Nessa could feel it, the turning of sympathy, the weight of accumulated small cruelties finally spoken aloud. Then Beatrice Ashford did the only thing she had left. She turned to the room and said, "Ask Mr. Hale to explain why his name appears on a deed signed in 1793. Ask him to explain why no one in this county has ever seen him age. Ask him what he is." The room turned to Elias. He stood. In the silence, every candle in the assembly room steadied and burned brighter. His shadow on the wall behind him fell at an angle that did not quite match his body. Someone in the front row noticed. Someone else looked away. Nessa stepped forward and stood beside him. Not in front, beside. "I know what he is," she said, her voice carrying through the room with the steadiness of someone who has spent a lifetime measuring doses and telling patients the truth. "He is the man who gave a stranger a gold sovereign for setting his shoulder. He is the man who kept a still room stocked for a healer he had not seen in 7 years. He is the man whose maid was burned and who, the moment he learned of it, ensured she was treated and safe." She looked at the room. "If what he is troubles you more than what she has done, then the trouble is not with him." Elias looked at Nessa. The room was watching. He did not care. "I have lived a long time," he said. The words were simple and precise, and contained more truth than anything else spoken that day. "Longer than any record in that stack. I am what I am. And the only person in this room who ever looked at me and saw a man instead of a mystery is standing next to me. She lied to me once. She is not lying now. I would trust her with every year I have left, and I have a great many." Margaret Thorne stood up in the 3rd row. Her eyes were red. "I withdraw the mortgage claim," she said. "Formally, completely. My late husband would have been ashamed of me, and he would have been right." Beatrice Ashford's brother closed his document case. Without the mortgage, the challenge collapsed. Without credibility, Ashford's accusations about Elias dissolved into the kind of wild accusation that polite society pretends not to hear. Ruth, standing by the door in her maid's uniform, her scarred hands visible for the first time without bandages, said nothing. But she was smiling. Spring arrived at Ravensmere the way Nessa's tinctures worked, slowly, then all at once. The still-room cottage was hers again, properly this time, with her name on the lease and her herbs spreading across every available surface. The garden responded to her attention with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting to be loved. Elias came to the still-room every evening. He no longer sat in the corner. He stood at the workbench beside her, grinding herbs with the careful pressure of someone who understood that healing, like trust, required patience and the correct amount of force. "You're bruising the thyme," Nessa said, adjusting his grip on the pestle. "I have been grinding things for centuries." "You've been grinding things badly for centuries. There's a difference." She guided his hand, warm fingers over cold, and felt the particular tension of two people who had survived something and could now touch without flinching. Margaret visited on Tuesdays, bringing village news and the particular brand of cheerful guilt that was her way of making amends. She had funded the rebuilding of Nessa's tincture supply and personally visited every shop that had stopped carrying her remedies. "I told the apothecary that if he didn't restock your shelves, I would tell his wife about the patent hair tonic he orders from London," Margaret said, settling into the good chair. "He restocked immediately." "That is not redemption, Margaret. That is blackmail." "It's efficient redemption. I'm working with the materials I have." Ruth was learning to make salves. Her hands had healed well. The scars would remain, but the pain was gone, and she had a steady, precise touch that Nessa recognized as a gift. On warm afternoons, Ruth and Nessa worked side by side in the garden while Elias read in the doorway. The three of them existed in the kind of comfortable silence that only comes after hard truths have been spoken and survived. On a June evening, when the still room smelled of lavender and beeswax, and the particular green sweetness of things growing, Elias set down his book and said, "You will outlive this garden." Nessa looked up from her mortar. "Everything outlives a garden. That's why you keep planting." "I mean," he stopped. For a man who had lived centuries, he was remarkably bad at saying the thing that mattered. "If you wanted, there is a way. You would not age. You would not—" "I know what you're offering." She set the pestle down. "I've known since I counted your pulse at 11 beats per minute on a frozen night in a shepherd's hut, and you were still warm enough to blush when I touched your ribs." "I did not blush." "You absolutely blushed. I'm a healer. I notice skin changes." She came around the workbench and stood in front of him. "I would lose the taste of my own cooking. I would lose the feeling of a warm bath being warm instead of just wet. I would lose growing old in a garden I planted." "Yes," he said, and she heard the cost in that single word, the centuries of watching things end. "And I would gain time," she said. "Enough time to teach Ruth everything I know. Enough time to plant a garden and see it grow and plant another. Enough time to stand next to you without worrying about leaving you alone again." She kissed him, once, briefly. His lips were cool and tasted of nothing and everything, and the particular sweetness of a man who had been waiting 7 years for someone to come back. "Ask me properly," she said. "Nessa Blackwood, will you stay?" "I'll stay. But you're learning to grind time correctly first. I refuse to spend eternity watching you bruise herbs." He laughed. It was a real laugh. Full, startled, slightly rusty. And it filled the still room the way sunlight fills a room when the curtains are finally opened. From the garden path, Margaret's voice carried through the open window. "Did he finally ask? I've been standing out here for 10 minutes. My shoes are soaked." "Go home, Margaret," Nessa called. "Not until someone confirms. Ruth and I have a wager." Nessa looked at Elias. Elias looked at Nessa. The lavender leaned through the window as if listening. "She said yes," Elias called out, and his voice carried the quiet wonder of a man who had just discovered that the recipe he had been following for centuries had one ingredient he had missed. It had been standing in his garden the whole time, smelling of rosemary, refusing to curtsy to anyone who did not deserve it. "About time," Margaret said. "Ruth, you owe me 6pence." Nessa turned back to her workbench, picked up the pestle, and began grinding lavender for a sleeping tonic that no one in the house would need tonight. Elias stood beside her, his cold hand resting against the small of her back, and the candle between them burned absolutely steady in the windless room. "You're still bruising it," she said. "I know," he said. "Show me again." She did.